Okay, so there's a outflow of Lobos Creek over here. And we'll just walk over a little bit above the creek to gather. Welcome guys, my name is Josh Halpern. As I think we've mentioned, I graduated from CIIS in 2013. I graduated as part of the Integral Ecology track, which is kind of a precursor to the ESR, the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program. And that's all about people's relationship with nature and how quickly that's transforming these days. So I might jump around in scales of time and place, and hopefully that'll kind of track as a bit of a narrative, but feel free to jump in if you know something that I don't, or anything I can help clarify. So before we talk about this creek, which is very significant in the history and current engagement with water in San Francisco, we have to address the largest body of water that we know about on the planet, which is right there, the Pacific. Proximity to the ocean for this part of the world, as you know, it affects everything. It affects the weather, it affects our proximity to wildfire smoke when that comes in, all the different, we were just talking about how dynamic the weather is. That dynamism and that kind of ability to shift back and forth, there's a lot of ways that impacts the culture here, and all of that is really dependent on the ocean. One way I like to engage, well, just as a background to this edge of the planet, you know, I think I mentioned I come from central New Jersey, but that landscape that I come from, you know, the east coast of the country was squished against the west coast of Africa, to the point where the mountains that grew there were as big or bigger than the Himalayas are now. So unlike that kind of land interaction where that's very old landscapes kind of shaped and wrangled with over that many millions of years. This one's just been floating out on the edge of the supercontinents this whole time. It hasn't smashed into anybody. It hasn't, I mean, it's very affected by the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ring of volcanoes, and there were 3 volcanoes in the East Bay. Obviously there's some major fault lines, and we'll talk a bit about that. But otherwise, it's just been the same kind of situation where it's been out on the edge. If you wanted to point to the nearest landmass, not Point Reyes, but out on the horizon, which direction would you point? That way? Is it, so if you're pointing to like Japan, or you're pointing to Australia, Hawaii, so okay, so which direction would you guess? That way. Okay. Probably south. But one thing that I like to blow my own mind with is you wouldn't actually point that way. You would actually point like that way, because the curve of the planet there is taken up so much by the ocean that there's a whole bunch of ocean that we have to get through before we get back to land. It wasn't a trick, it was just a curiosity. You remember? We're trying to stay curious. The Farallones. Well, yeah, that used to be the edge of the coast when the Ice Age was trapping the bay. But we'll get into that too. Yeah. A little bit more energetic tuning in. This is a thin inlet throat where almost half of California's rivers come out through this little narrow spot between the Coast Range here. There are anadromous fish like salmon swimming upstream here. Well, at this time of year, they're probably swimming out, and then after a number of years of their bodies changing in the ocean, they're going to swim back up to their rivers if they're able to get over dams and around obstacles. There's a lot of life and energy passing through. It's also tidally locked to the delta still. So there's this enormous daily ebb and flow, this breathing in and out of the whole waterway, going up into the foothills and then coming back down out to the ocean. This was called, it's Lobos Creek. Do you guys know what Lobos means?
Wolf?
Sea wolf.
Sea wolf.
And that was a name for sea lions. And sea lions are one of the biggest marine mammals around. I imagine there was a point when this area was teeming with sea lions, and that kind of kind of cacophony. Was that too loud? Okay. Well, imagine like a whole bunch of sea lions. We've also seen, I did a tour up the Sacramento River to Shasta with some 8th graders a couple months ago, and we saw sea lions in Sacramento because they're going that far upstream to find food these days. But this is significant because it's one of the last above ground, free-flowing creeks in San Francisco, and it's the only one that's still used for drinking water. And one of the fundamental differences between water that we can't drink and water we can is it makes all of our choices really place-based. Because we can't live. How long can we live without water?
A week.
A week is generous.
It's been done.
It's been done. I had a friend who just drank coconut water, but that for like a month or however long, 100 days. But he was still drinking water. I think 3 days to a week is probably in the range. And there are animals like the desert tortoise where if they just like pull water in on their scales and it allows them to go their whole life without drinking water. But if you scare them and they pee, they'll die because that's their whole water reserve.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit on the way in about the cleanliness of our water, and that's a major question that's come up in these last 10 years of doing watershed tours is how clean is the water that I drink? And what I usually say is, it's so clean compared to billions and billions of people around the world who don't have access to clean water. Billions of kids who are dying from lack of access to clean water every day. And so in that context, I do these watershed tours of where our drinking water sources come from. So in the Presidio, it's something like, 80% of the Presidio is from this drinking water, is from this creek.
Oh, wow.
20% is from where? Where else does San Francisco get its drinking water? Hetchy.
Crissy Springs, Hetchy.
Hetchy, yeah, up the Tuolumne River, yeah. And there's a water treatment plant right near here that in the Presidio that treats this water specifically, and there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do. But all of this is to orient to just how fundamental drinking water is. There may be things that we disagree on, but we share this commonality with all living beings that we need water, and we may get into complicated engagements about where our water comes from, how much is left, if we have the ability to share it or not. Because I really want my water, and if somebody else needs it, that's a really hard question, right? And that's playing out in many, many ways around the world these days. Okay, I just have a couple more historical orientations, and then we'll start heading to the next spot. And if we want to gather some water here. So, Spanish explorers. So we're about halfway in between two Yelamu villages. There was one over by Sutro Baths, sort of around that rock there. And then there's one at the place that we're going to next, which is the Petlanuk village. And they were seasonal. So this is one of the colder places in the bay, obviously. This would be more of a summer village. But we'll talk about that as we go around. In terms of the arrival of white folks, this little entrance here, it took many years of Spanish explorers passing by in the fog before they realized that was a whole exploitable estuary down that route. I think it was, you know, at least 20 years before somebody actually realized they had to come up over the mountains in the South Bay and spot it there, and then come through the East Bay and sort of clock it from Oakland before they recognized what was at stake here. So the first, 1577, that's Sir Francis Drake landing over at Point Reyes. It's right where the San Andreas Fault touches land again there at the estuary. And he was greeted by Miwok, coastal Miwok communities who offered feathers and baskets. And of course, the Europeans were ashamed for them for their nakedness and tried to cover them up. Though it ended up being that the women did, of the Miwok community, did a grief ritual where they tore at their skin. And of course, Drake interpreted that as they were treating him like a god. So the first white guy to white guy here on this coast. And they, so what that allowed him to do was declare Point Reyes as Nova Albion. He saw the white cliffs over there by the estuary. It reminded him of the cliffs of Dover. And so he said, everything from the Virginia colonies to here is English. And that set him up with fights with the Spanish who were coming up. This was New Spain. And it set him up with fights with the Russians who were coming down from the north. Yeah, we'll get a little bit more into the arrogance and even sort of the apocalyptic hubris of some of the colonists as they come in. Yeah, the creek here, there is a mountain lakes up the watershed from Lobos Creek. That's right along the Route 1 highway before you come down to the bridge here. That's not precisely the headwaters for this creek, but it's around there. There's a lot of aquifers under the ground here that allow these creeks to be flowing so much for so long, even with all of the drawing out for drinking water. In 1776, which is when Anza came through the first expedition, setting up the Presidio, the fortress at the top. He saw, obviously, sand dunes. We still got a little bit of sand dunes, but that was a third of San Francisco was sand dunes. And most of those have been demolished and knocked down. There were wildflowers everywhere, which would have been the result of controlled burns that the Alamo were using to sort of garden the landscape. There were yerba buena herbs, which ended up being the name of that early town over in North Beach, because there was such a proliferation of this sweet minty herb. And the Spanish army cleared the oaks. This deforestation of the old growth forests in the North Bay and the East Bay to build these cities really devastated these deeper, older ecosystems. And you know, the city burned 3 times in its first year or two, since because it was all wood and it was all these drunk gold rushers, and they just kept setting fire to the city. And then it's like, all right, you're wasting the beings that were these trees. That's a whole other question. But there was a butterfly, which I have an image of at our fourth stop. It's the Xerces butterfly. It's kind of purpley.
There's a mission blue butterfly.
Well, this one is extinct because it's the first butterfly that went extinct in maybe the world, but as a result of human habitat interaction, because it only lived here, only lived in this little part of the peninsula, the Xerces butterfly. Yeah, and okay, so last things I'll say is is a military base from 1812 to 1997. So there's been rehabilitation to the ecosystems here, but there was still a lot of Army and Navy and Air Force pollution that's still kind of embedded in the landscape here. And this is not the cleanest of all waters. Now, they do a lot to make it drinkable, but I wouldn't just drink it for sure. Though I did bring a life straw just in case anybody wanted to try. And I wouldn't swim in it necessarily without taking a shower afterwards. But there.
Because of the PCPs or other things that you're thinking?
Here it was the broken sewer pipes. That's going to be a recurring thing because a lot of the sewer pipes and the storm drains are the same pipes. And so, especially down in the Mission when we get into that last bit of the tour, there's a lot of ways the neighbors are trying to engage with those old antiquated systems that are using those same pipes. But okay, there's some of these, there are some Leysingia plant, which is the silver with pink flowers. I guess June is the best time for flowers here, though the person who said that also said that it's shifting, like you were saying, the microclimates are shifting. And north end of Baker Beach was the site of the first Burning Man gathering in 1986, not 1896, but 1986. And then and there's also a nude beach at the very top. But we're only going to be here. We're done. We're done with this beach. Thank you for sitting through that little bit. Would you like to collect water?
Yes.
And we'll just add our waters. And as you know, all the waters are connected. They hold memory. We are not too far from where we just were. And this was a village called Petlanook. It was kind of in between these two creeks, the last one to flow on this side and the first one to flow on that side, on either side of the bridge. And we'll get into some even deeper time explorations. My intention is to have us draw water from the creek just out on the beach there where it kind of meets the bay. And then I think maybe a good spot is there's a bridge over the creek right down that path. And that might be a good place to gather out of the wind, but still over the creek. Does that seem workable? Yeah. So let's fill up our jars first, and then we'll gather and share over on that little bridge. A lot of the original outline of the bay was very permeable, was very ebbs and flows of tidal marsh and spread out deltas of creeks, and it would only be after, generations and generations of outflow that you would carve a real creek bank into a landmass. But anyway, I'm just getting into the kind of astonishment sometimes that's been part of I've been doing these watershed tours for 10 years, and going back each time it's a little different. And that's part of the witnessing. Sometimes the reservoirs are really high, sometimes they're shockingly low. When I started in 2015, we were at the bottom of a drought, so I felt it was really crucial to get people out to their drinking water reservoirs so that they could see how much was left. And then we have, this pendulum of extra rainy years, all these atmospheric rivers coming in, and then, we're trending more towards drought and mega drought. So it's just this chaotic situation where you don't necessarily know what to predict. Let's do some more deep time orienting here. Are you guys comfortable here?
I'd like to sit.
Oh, okay, great. Let's hop up right on this dune right here. Would that work?
That would be cool.
Okay, great. Originally, this creek was passing the village of Petlanook, so almost half of California's rivers flow out from the mountains, from the Sacramento systems to the north, and the San Joaquin systems to the south, and it all passes through this thin inlet throat, the lowest point in the Coast Range, this creek right here is the final creek of the confluence.
Oh, cool.
All of those rivers, all of those gallons and gallons and gallons of water pouring out of the mountains and the snowpacks and the aquifers and the water tables. And this is the last one going into the bay, because after this, it's not the bay anymore, it's the ocean. And this whole bay has risen and fallen at least 5 or 6 times in the last 10 million years. So instead of this big open water, you would just have this pretty impressive river at the bottom of this long sloping valley in between here and the North Bay. There are also indigenous accounts of before humans, so a lot of the local indigenous creation myths begin at Mount Diablo. Tushtak or Yombale, Tushtak especially for the Ohlone, that was their name of that mountain, and they say that it was just an island in a big sea, and that Wek the falcon flew out over the landscape and dropped a feather in each place where a village of humans would arise. And we know that humans arrived here at least 6,000 years ago, if not earlier, and the final ice age receded about 5,000 years ago. Do I have that right? I think that's right. So
5,000 years ago, not the 10,000 of.
Yeah, that's what, as I say it, I think it's 10. I think it's 10 and 11 instead of 5 and 6. Okay. But I'll have to go back out. I apologize. Yeah. If you guys know something that I'm getting wrong, or that it's a skill share. It's a knowledge base that we're drawing from. The main point being, there were humans here while it was still a river, before the bay rose. So even if we don't believe that the water got all the way to the top of Mount Diablo, there was a vast inland sea in the Central Valley, and there was this long river that passed through. So there's a couple things that I want to draw attention to about that time on Earth, when California looked like that, with this huge inland sea and this river coming through. There was even a time before the estuary existed, when the water came out from the inland sea down in Monterey. It was the Salinas River that was the outflow. And some of you might know, if you go to it's not Santa Cruz, it's right in the center of Monterey Bay. There's an enormous canyon under the water. It's as deep as the Grand Canyon. It's in
the Elkhorn Slough?
Yeah. It's right there in the middle. And that kind of canyon, that kind of underwater gouging can only happen from an enormous river, like a Mississippi or a Nile. It's not here. The underneath the Bay Bridge is the lowest point in the whole bay. So there has been some carving out of a canyon right under the bridge, but it's not anywhere near the level. That's why they have the aquarium there, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, because there's so much they can study in the deep part of the ocean, right where that system carved out. But the Santa Cruz Mountains rose up, and they eventually blocked off that route to the sea. And so that inner space filled up with water for like the whole Pleistocene era. And then there was a cataclysmic event where the Carquinez Strait burst open, and the fresh water and the salt water from the sea were able to mix in the estuary here. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of these cataclysmic events as generative in this case, because there's so many species that can only be born in that brackish water, in that mix of fresh water and salty water. And so even though that was if you lived by the Carquinez Strait at that moment, the whole collapsing ridge and all the water pouring through would have seemed like the end of the world. But it allowed new space and new creatures to be born. And there's other examples of that. Theia, the Mars-sized planet crashing to create the moon. That was an event so cataclysmic that lava was, spewing out into space and swirling around. But in a relatively short time, the moon sort of coagulated and formed and started going around the Earth, and everything cooled down. And there's also a theory that event marked the beginning of water on the planet. That Theia was one of the main bringers of water to that original hot volcanic Earth.
A planet?
That was Theia was a Mars-sized planet, so a little bit smaller than Earth, that the theory goes collided with Earth, and that's how we get such a large, close moon. Petlanuk, seasonal Yelamu villages. This was the northern portion of the peninsula. The Ramaytush language is spoken all the way down to Pacifica, but the Yelamu were the communities that lived on this half, where the city of San Francisco is now. And a lot of their villages were seasonal, so this being, as I said, one of the colder parts of the bay, this would probably be more of a summer village, and then they would move, depending on resources, acorns, following animals around. There were certainly tons and tons of diverse creatures that were here up until we killed them. The fullest abundance of indigenous community was, there was a count in the early 1900s of shell mounds. Do you all know what I mean when I say shell mounds?
No.
Okay, yeah, so there were about 400 to 500 shell mounds along the edges of the bay, and those were places where native villages would accumulate generations of both shells, so like oyster shells and mussel shells and clams and all the sort of stuff that gets tossed when you're a family eating in the same place, similar creatures for generations and generations. But it's also the location of, there's human remains mixed in. And there's a lot of ashes, there's a lot of, it becomes the sort of lived accumulation of your time there, because a lot of the villages were built on top of the shell mounds. The largest was in Emeryville in South Berkeley. Hey, that was about 60 feet high, 600 feet wide. Of course, almost all of the shell mounds have been bulldozed and flattened now, along with the 95% of the bay has been sort of like paved and channeled, and so it's hard to sort of imagine the sort of nebulousness of the shoreline, but you could picture like all these like shell mounds with smoke, sort of all these sort of smoke signals coming up, signifying different, having different meanings, and sort of registering that you're sharing this huge body of water with these other families. And there's a book, I brought a couple books, and there's a pretty detailed account of the time that the settlers and the mission systems were coming in, and the longing that the kidnapped Ohlone from the East Bay had, looking out over the bay to their long lost peaks that they could only see from the distance now. And I was saying to Emma on the way over here, like, I think one of the things that's really hard maybe especially given everything happening politically and how quickly things are changing in the country, and I'll only drop politics here and there, people maybe have a hard time dealing with anyone else's heartbreak. I think that's maybe some underlying unwillingness to face the heartbreak of anybody else. And that shows up in a lot of ways, and one of them is in histories that we don't allow to be shared or that get hidden. Okay.
That's good. We got to hear about it.
So here's an example of hidden history, and that reminds me. So when before this was a bay, when it was just a river, there's Alcatraz. We were talking about that. It was a prison. It got occupied by Native Americans in the late 60s and early 70s. I've been there every Thanksgiving morning at like 5 a.m. because they have an Alterna Thanksgiving there. So if you triangulate between Alcatraz, this is Angel Island here, this kind of long sloping triangular island. That had a enormous amount of sacredness to the Ohlone and the coastal Miwok. But between that island, and the Golden Gate, there are 3 huge rock formations under the water. One of them was 300 feet high. And, right now, there tends to be, like in modern day, because there's so many different kinds of fish and sharks and all kinds of underwater creatures that all gather around there tends to be a lot of fishing trawlers that come up over there, and you'll see like 50 of them at a time trying to bring up fish from around those submerged rocks. But before it was the bay, there's a theory that it would have been a pretty perfect place because it would have been a migration route of like megafauna, of like saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths. And if you could drive them in between those 3 rocks and kind of get a spear over them and drop down on them, that would have been a pretty perfect place for hunting. So of course, as those kinds of shipping container ships got larger and larger, they blew up the rocks because, they couldn't because the ships kept hitting them more and more as the ships got bigger. They blow it up a little bit when it's just little ships, but as you get more and more global shipping, you brought up Mount Tamalpais and the shape from certain angles of her looking like a sleeping woman. There was a 3rd peak of Mount Tam. There was a highest peak of Mount Tam that also got blown up.
What?
Because they wanted to put a radio tower up there and nuclear missiles. And there were nuclear missiles tucked away. They were on Angel Island. They were over by Lake Chabot in the East Bay. And there was a big radio tower. So in fact, Mount Tam doesn't look anything like it used to look after they blew up the highest peak.
There, the remains.
Yeah. I mean,
Like people don't
true.
know about it, but it's still there.
She lives on Mount Tam.
Yeah. And they have to, they haven't allowed people at that radio tower because it's still got all this radiation and shit. But
Yeah, but also because they don't want people to know that this happened.
yeah, right.
People would be livid.
Yeah, I know. I can't imagine being here at the time. And
I don't know how to get there.
it's if you're going to the 3rd peak on this side, you kind of pass by it. But it's not accessible unless you sneak in. That's a whole other tour, but okay. I have a question before we move on to the next spot. I'll try not to trip over rocks. Why did they put the city here? You come in through this Golden Gate and you have this huge bay. Why did the major city end up right on this little curvy peninsula? Anybody have an idea?
Less earthquakey.
I think it's maybe more earthquakey. The San Andreas is right there. Yeah, there's the Hayward Fault in Oakland, or from along the hills in the East Bay. I wonder if you know where you are in relation to the fault
wonder
line
too.
there. Okay, well, we'll find out. But that's a good guess.
It's all around at North Beach where the city was.
It was in North Beach. Yeah, there was the guy who founded North Beach as Yerba Buena was an Englishman who came on one of the ships and just had a big party with a big hacienda kind of all night drinking fest, and fell in with the daughter of the Spanish commander, and he ended up taking his little boat out and conducting all the trade after Mexico opened up trade with foreign nations. So before the Americans took over, sort of before the gold rush, that guy, the reason he was sort of handed the keys by the Mexican governor as the founder of Yerba Buena was because he was the guy who could go out on his little boat and conduct all the trade for anybody who was coming into the bay. That was a really important, significant position. So the answer to the question is it's deep. The water's deep through here, and it was very easy for the gold rush ships to pour into the bay and crash into the city. There's still, I'll have a map, but there's still 70 ships under the financial district that they just built the city over. Instead of this long sloping sediment on the East Bay side, Oakland, in order to get ships through that channel at Alameda, they have to go through this very narrow track, because otherwise it's this long, sort of gently sloping, sandy sediment from all the rivers. And, there's also this example of hydraulic mining had a big effect on the sediment. That was when Anthony Chabot invented taking the rivers and blasting the mountains with them to try to get gold out of the mountains. He did that on the Yuba mostly, but that had an enormous amount of slough then coming out of those rivers. Hydraulic mining. I think we've pretty much talked about anything. The last two things I'll say are, if we went up the beach, there's a tide organ. Have you guys heard of that? Yeah, there's a it's actually built of old cemetery marble. But if you go there during high tide, we're right around, I think low tide is at 2:40, so 10 minutes ago. We're about as low tide as this is going to be. But if you're there during high tide, or especially during choppy waters, the way the water splashes up on the tide organ, it makes a bong 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 kind of sounds. And then the last thing I'll leave you with while we're here is I talked about the canyon in Monterey Bay that got carved out, and that underneath the Golden Gate Bridge is the deepest part of the whole bay. If you were here when it was a river, that section of river drops down several hundred feet as it passes through that channel. And so what that implies is, in that time when it was a river, there was a very impressive series of cascading waterfalls right underneath where the Golden Gate Bridge is now. All right. So we're gonna go to the headwaters of this Petaluma Creek up there, and that'll be our third spot. All right, come on. This spring was a source of fresh water for the Yelamu for thousands and thousands of years. It was a deciding factor when Anza and his crew came up in 1776. That's one of the main reasons did you make it across? Okay. It's one of the main reasons that they chose to put the Presidio here and build their fortress because they needed fresh water. We'll talk a little bit about the spring that was identified down by the mission. That'll be our fifth stop. But this was the first real white settlement in the Bay Area. And it all started from the spring, and all the rancherias, they would start off here at the Presidio. They would, get in their finest silver cloaks and go out on their horses, and, the Peraltas, that him and his sons would go gallop over to the East Bay, and then they'd find the right creek, and they'd shoot a rifle in the air in the 4 directions, and then go, okay, sons, you get this stretch of land, and I give you the deed to this stretch of land. Speaking of sons.
Speaking of not being able to hear you.
So this was kind of it was the upper reach of the mission system. And we'll talk more about the mission system and the torture and the enslavement that came along with that, the apocalypse that they brought upon the indigenous community here. But one of the compelling stories from this spring, El Polín, do you guys know what Polín means?
No.
So it's basically a Spanish machismo joke. It's the poles. There were these long poles that were used to, like giant rolling timbers that were used on the docks to load the ships. And the reason that they named it after those is because there were indigenous accounts of twins being born if a mother came to this spring during a full moon.
Oh!
And so that was going back with the Yelamu and the Ohlone and folks who lived here. But then when the Spanish moved in, that kept happening. So there's a couple accounts. There was a Discorso Historica from 1876. General Vallejo described the very good water which demonstrated miraculous qualities, citing numerous offspring of garrison wives, all of whom several times had twins, and listed them by family name, and number of children produced 13, 18, 22, which I have not given birth, but 22 seems like too many.
From one woman.
From one mother, yeah. There was a notice extraordinary from 1947 announcing a one-day sale of the authentic, original and ardent water of El Polín. And it said, wonderful for man and beast, Colonel Mason's sick jackass drank its waters, recovered, gave every sign of being a well jackass, and sired twin foals from an army mule. Yeah, and the mules are infertile, so that's a whole major claim right there. The more significant person who lived here was Juana Briones, and she is an example of a really fundamental founding member of the San Francisco and Yerba Buena communities that often gets missed in the histories of the city. So she was she was born near Santa Cruz when it was mostly indigenous there. She was of mixed heritage. She was a curandera, so she worked with herbs, a midwife, a doula, sort of medicine woman, a merchant as that started coming on, a landowner, one of the first women landowners, and she in terms of being able to own the land, that was easier with Mexico once the U.S. took on and tried to take over everything. She actually took her land title case to the Supreme Court and won, even though she was illiterate. She had 11 children. She was born at this pueblo that when we walked up here, we passed by where her adobe was. So on the way back out, we can check out some of the reconstruction there. And there's sort of significant it's a significant method for building an adobe because it withstood the weather here by the ocean, and also was more earthquake-proof, fire-proof. There's a lot to learn from those original construction methods. And she died in a cattle stampede at like 80. Which is
Where was that?
well, I don't know totally where she ended up. I could check. She didn't live here her whole life, but that's a pretty exciting way to go out if you're gonna and this little valley was kind of the first suburbs, because that was the army base, and this was where the families lived, and now it's being rehabbed. It's a diverse habitat for lots of different kinds of birds, and they've set up this whole scene here to kind of try to recreate some of what it, not obviously what it would have looked like, but at least a way to connect and kind of tune into some of that history.
Where is the headwaters of this?
Yeah, so we could probably find it if we followed up that path, or we followed up this path. Do you guys want to do that next? Yeah, it's a little bit hard to reach where it actually comes out of. It's a little bit sort of in the bush, but we can pick a place wherever you want to gather water from, and then we'll head back out and
So in the rehab,
the
did
next
they
spot.
put this rock?
Yeah, they put all
stuff?
these stones
Okay. Otherwise,
down.
it was just mud.
It was just mud. Yeah, it was just flowing down through, and they built this little well as a gathering spot. And
Is the water coming from those mountain lakes things near the tunnel?
so the first creek that we were at, Los Lobos, that comes from around Mountain Lake.
Oh, okay.
This one comes from here. This is the headwaters. This is the source. It comes right up out of the ground, right over there. Underground, like a spring. And it's been going this whole time. And if you come here during a full moon, let me know what happens.
And 11 children and 22, isn't it the sacred number?
Oh, sure. Oh.
You don't need to drink the water, right? You just come here.
I wouldn't. Maybe if you go right up to the edge. But even then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as far as these things go, as long as there's nobody pooping right above it or whatever. Okay.
None of the sewers are leaking.
Well, again, if it's coming right out of the mountain there, it doesn't have too far to cross sewage lines. But yeah. All right, I'm gonna gather a little bit, maybe from here. But let's go up here. See if you guys can figure out where it comes out. There's some sense of, over many generations, they would have cultivated those acorns, used grinding rocks nearby. There's an enormous grinding rock that we visit on our McCullamy tour, with like 200-300 divots all on the same rock, right near the right near the river, and underneath these enormous sort of grandmother oaks, just old beings.
Did they do burns for those oak trees?
Sure, yeah. I believe this part is part of the reconstructed adobe. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Looks like a real adobe. I wonder how it was different than the other adobe things. The mission's just all melted.
I have a little bit of that info. So it was infilling a crib of horizontal redwood boards with adobe.
Oh.
And so it provided her dwelling with excellent insulation, but protected the building material from erosion and destruction from earthquakes. And it would have exhibited the usual adobe layout where you had a strip of connected rooms with an interior corridor. And like a dancing area sort of next to on the outside.
Always a great.
Oh yeah, what else do you need?
Yeah.
A little privacy and then places to dance. as I mentioned, we have some seeping creeks. That's fresh water emerging out of the ground here. And you were asking about aquifers. There's all this hidden water underground, and especially given that the city gets its drinking water from Hetch Hetchy for the most part, it's really compelling that there's still actual fresh drinkable water underneath our feet all the time here that we're not using. This was a watering hole. Alamo Square, before the park, there was a lone cottonwood tree. That's what Alamo means.
Oh.
And it was halfway between the Presidio and the Mission. So if you're riding your horse and you needed to stop, this was the spot to stop.
That'd be cool.
And there were all these drinking. Yeah, we'll get into the flooding maps too.
Catastrophe for the farming.
Yeah,
for the whole country.
we're headed in that direction. The even without this major flood, we'll get into the flooding maps.
Okay.
But no, I don't mean to shush you at all. We can always jump around. But in fact, the main flooding map, if you want to skip ahead, this one, the archipelago, San Francisco archipelago.
What?
Because there's nothing here between this hill and the East Bay Hills. There's no other hills. That's all the flatlands. This was all open bay out where the financial district is now.
But that's
Right.
200. That's a lot.
It's a lot,
Yeah.
but there's a lot already baked in.
Yeah.
The sea levels are rising already based on what we've been doing the last 100 years.
Faster than
It's and it's always 30 years behind.
That'd be
So
crazy.
The
Yeah,
glaciers
Bay
are
of
in
Castro.
trouble.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
let's see, the painted ladies, you need 3 or more colors to be a painted lady. It was originally Hobnob Hill, or I guess nabob was a slang for wealthy British officials who made their money colonizing India. So these were mostly railroad barons that built these mansions in the 1870s. And
These painted lady.
these painted lady mansions, yeah. This was all pre-Full House, of course. They're like 10,000 square feet. I think Alice Walker lived in one of them for a while.
That's cool. 1,000 square feet, really?
That's what they say.
That big.
CIIS, you can't really see that building with the angles. CIIS is kind of tucked down in there. That was about a block or 2 from where the original shoreline is. It was mostly that open bay. What else? We'll talk a little bit about what flows down from here. Do you guys know what the Wiggle is?
No.
There was a PCC
dance, right?
studio. Yeah, and there's a lot of creatures who wiggle. But there's a dry creek bed that's one of the only flat ways through this part of the city, and so it's a bike path now. And one of the PCC students from about 15 years ago helped develop that bike path so that folks wouldn't have to go up and over hills and around. It was also a trail used between Petlinek and Chuchui, which will be the indigenous village at the next stop that we go to, at the spring that was there down by the Mission. And it was a horseback connector called the Old Spanish Trail. It's also, we're on the edge of, not that I know a ton about geology, but we're kind of switching between the serpentine permeable rock by the ocean and the bay and the Franciscan Church, which kind of makes this hill the very upper edge of the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This hill?
This hill right here.
Very cool.
Oh, that is cool.
Wow.
And then those seeps, as they come up underground and flow downstream, they actually end up about 15 feet underground, and they take on more and more rivers, and they become this vast flowing underground river out of Hayes Creek. So starting from sort of very humble little puddles. So for example, there's several fountains that use Hayes Creek. One is in the Fillmore. which is a whole story about a diverse neighborhood that then was redlined out. It was the Harlem of the West, and then they sent all the black folks out of the neighborhood. There's the UN fountain, kind of near CIIS.
In the library?
Yeah, that's been turned off more recently because of the unhoused folks using it as a restroom.
Yeah.
There's also the Powell Street BART station has huge water pumps because there's so much water passing through there. They call it the rainforest. City workers who work on that subway.
And that's why these fountains are there, because they actually.
And that they somehow they do a little bit of alleviating of that water flow. Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. Okay, so we'll go through a little bit more of what's around the mission when we get to the next stop. But let's do a little look at these maps, huh?
Yeah.
This is a good one. This is there's actually a version of this on a corner not too far from here. Is it upside down? No. Seep City. So this is an example of all the seeps and creeks.
Oh, that's a cool map.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? He's a great, he's an inspiration in terms of this kind of work.
Think walk?
ThinkWalks, Joel Pomerantz. I almost got it right. Joel Pomerantz. And do you guys know where we are now? Can you figure?
In the middle.
Somewhere over here.
Well, that's where we were, right?
No, it's
That's where we
behind
started. We started over here. That's
down.
that's Lobos Creek, and then we ended up
there.
over Petlinuk.
In the middle, right?
So yeah, we're kind of here-ish. We're kind of Alamo Square, because this is where we're going to be going down Hayes Creek, which is around here, and Mission Creek. Yeah.
That is so cool.
Okay. So we'll just spend a couple minutes on these maps. We don't have to get too drawn into it. And if you notice anything, let me know. Let's go over the ones that we already looked at. This is the waterfall under the Golden Gate.
Oh, wow, that's
Oh,
You
that's
can
an
kind of
awesome
see the
picture.
depths of where it plummets down there. Yeah, imagine kind of what it would be
That's
like
so
flowing.
Cool.
This is those three rocks that I mentioned where you would triangulate megafauna through there. You would get the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and jump on them.
Oh, and the ships that they were clearing it out.
And the ships that they were clearing out there.
So
This
cool.
is the gold rush ships that they crashed into the financial district, what became the financial district, and they're still all buried underneath there. Right?
Insane.
This is the vast inland lake, not just Tulare Lake at the bottom, but Tulare, thank you, but Corcoran Lake. And you can see how much of the inner, you can also see it on this old map here, how much of that inner valley was taken up by the water. And then this is that canyon outside of the Monterey Bay Aquarium that I mentioned, this deep cut by this ancient river that no longer flows through there.
All right, so what are these again?
This is Lake Corcoran. It was the original drainage of the all the waters, especially of the Ice Age. I mean, really, to get that level of river, you need all that ice melting coming down from Canada and just pouring through here, and then it burst, and then we have that example of generative cataclysm, where you have this event that's destructive, but it forms a creation of an estuary that then allows other beings to be born. This is the full system. This is the half of California's water flowing out the Golden Gate. This is a little bit of that same sort of it's a little bit small, but you can see how deep the carve is at the bottom of the bay. We're getting through. Let's look at the Xerces. We're almost there. We'll look at that one. I got this one. Let's see the Xerces butterfly. This is the butterfly that went extinct at that first creek. And it went extinct a while ago, 80 years ago. And so we haven't had this because there was just one place it lived in the world and we took it over. But it's beautiful.
One plant.
We're assholes.
I mean, that explains a lot of what's happened.
Yeah.
This little Estero map here, that's the first European sketch of the bay when they were over on the East Bay and looking over. So this is kind of Oakland here, looking out towards Alcatraz and Angel Island and the Marin Headlands, exactly.
That's cool.
This is Anza's expedition coming up, a whole bunch of different families.
The first overland.
The first overland of white folks coming up.
They came with ships before.
Again, this is the locations of these villages. So we started about here, and we were just in Petlanuk, and we're coming down to Sitlantek.
Chuchui.
Yeah, Chuchui. Chuchui was more by the mission. So where we're going next before our last spot is in this sort of Chuchui area.
So what about Lake Merced?
Lake Merced down there. Yeah, I think that was more of a winter. How did the watershed tour of Lake Merced? Well, you have to come on that watershed tour.
Oh, cool.
Shell heaps. This was all 400 or so of the shell mounds around the bay. One of the original maps. I see you're interested in these. This is a little bit in conjunction with that map, that flooding map, because this is some of the land uses and infrastructure that are in the flood zones. And that really does go with this too. Right. Housing and schools and airports and okay, so there's just
Electricity.
2 more maps that I'm into, even though they're slightly larger maps. So we talk about watersheds, we talk about food sheds, we talk about community sheds. These are star sheds and galaxy sheds. So to my understanding, this is the largest map of our neighborhood that we have. And it's the nearest stars, our spot in the galaxies, and our supercluster of galaxies, Laniakea, which is made up of 100,000 galaxies, each with billions of stars, billions of planets, and there's a branching pattern that happens at all of these different scales.
At the star scale?
At the star scale too, you can see. All of these galaxies here are flowing towards this point. That's like these are like the headwaters, and that's like the outflow.
Oh my gosh. Local void.
The local void. We're nearer a void in the galaxy than we are a cluster. So I have a theory about that, which is it's kind of like, what do I know? I'm just imagining. But I think where we are in the universe is a little bit like an old country road. And there's not a lot going on because we can look out there and we can see all the stars we see are just, with our eyes, are just in this little arm, in between these 2 big arms of the galaxy. So if we were in the center of the galaxy where there's a lot going on, or we were in the center of the supercluster, I feel like there wouldn't be any doubt that we're alone in the universe, because there's probably a lot of life and light that takes place in those parts of the universe. But where we are, it's a little lonely. There's maybe a myth of separation that can develop in a part of the universe like that. So I just wonder about those connections.
Are we abandoned?
That's a good question.
Ooh, what a good
Do you feel abandoned? Yeah, me too. So maybe that's some core part of that wound.
Finding our way home?
Yeah, finding our way
We're
home.
not in a constellation with a lot of other...
We're nearer an empty part of the universe than we are a clustered part.
Wow. Okay, and this is the cluster.
That is
Amazing.
this is the supercluster. That's 100,000, but we're right in the middle, and we're closer to this part where there's not a lot going on than these long threads. I'll just show you these books that I brought, and then we can head on to the next spot. These are only a few, obviously, of the books that I...
Oh, I like the water one.
This one is by Dr. Elizabeth McAnally. She spoke at the summit. She's been a friend since we came up in the same program.
Out here so we could take
Yes,
pictures?
yes. State of Water. This has been a lot of inspiration, Donna Haraway. That's a book of poems from the Bay. This I haven't read yet, but I was recommended, or this one, but they were both recommended to me at my last Watershed tour. So
Water always wins.
Water always wins, yeah. And then this one is indigenous accounts that were all recorded at the beginning part of the last century. So it's this one, Dawn of the World. That's a beautiful book. This may be a part where we can't collect water because this is actually the location of a long lost laguna. So on some original maps, when Anza came up, when Font came up, when the first Europeans were coming through there and looking for places to build the mission and grow crops and force the Native Americans to grow those crops and you know, nearby villages from which to enslave folks. Right, there was the Setlanek village over there. And then there's a spring that comes up right at this corner. And it probably collected here, and it probably, like, we're basically just uphill from where they did build the mission, Mission Dolores. And so there's a map, and there's some historical maps, and there's even a map at Camp Street in Albion that shows the laguna, but it wasn't really there. It was seasonal. There were a number. It was connected to the bay. You could float on a tool canoe from here down to the bay and up, but it wasn't a proper laguna as we would consider it. It wasn't a proper lake in that way. I don't have too much to offer here. I mean, there's lots we could say about you know, the Anza and Font expedition, and they named it Dolores because they found it on the day of Saint Dolores, so it means Lady of Our Sorrows, which may be fitting in a certain way, given that we've been talking about what happened to the indigenous folks and the sorrowful nature of that and the heartbreak that we're trying to tune into as we dig up some of these lost histories. Yeah, there was a reservoir street. There's a reservoir street just around the block, but they bulldozed the reservoir. There's
From the laguna, or how's the reservoir?
it was a slightly different. There's a number of flows that come down through here. There was a washerwoman's lagoon that's now covered up in the dog patch, and you know, I had a whole thing on Junipero Serra's self-flagellation, but we don't have to get into that too much.
We can. Junipero Serra.
What does that have to do with water?
I think it has to do with more like this theme of like, I don't know, repentance for like what you're acknowledging is harmful or not. There was somebody who was such a vivid follower of Junipero Serra that he came up at the church and like beat himself to death in front of him because he was such a sinner that he deserved to be, you know, hurt to the point of death. And it's like, I just feel like it's missing. They were also beating the indigenous folks, the Yelamu, the Miwok, anyone that they could bring in. They separated the genders. They separated them from their language. It was a apocalypse for that community, and they're only interested in the one apocalypse that counts. And this one. Only certain people will be saved. It's like a selective salvation that is born from those particular apocalypses. I also think that there's a thread to like Peter Thiel and the tech oligarchs now, because they have a similar thing. They're trying to advance and accelerate an apocalypse that they can be the ones who reign over. They can be the only ones who get to survive while everybody else is left to fend for ourselves.
There's an issue of sacrifice and suffering.
But I just think it's this interesting hidden story. It's like a shadow myth of the Bay Area that these stories keep coming up. So in between here, we're gonna go look at something on that corner in a second, but if we stopped, and I'll include some other stops in an integration email so that you can know if you get a chance, other places we can stop. But there was a ghost arroyo project where they painted Hayes Creek on the sidewalk. That was in 2015. There's groundwater that flows under the armory. There's also there's permeable sidewalks, so like neighborhoods doing their best to deal with the flooding. We were talking about the pipes that carry the sewage water and the storm water are the same pipes. So a lot of folks will have their toilets backing up down in those neighborhoods, or they'll have their something like this kind of bubbling up out of the ground. And you know, a lot of those places are built on fill, not just the gold rush ships, but a lot of trash, a lot of like wreckage from the earthquake that's been used to fill in there. And there's liquefaction possibilities. If you shake the ground hard enough, the ground can turn to mush. There's already leaning towers. The Millennium Tower has been drifting slowly sideways. So anyway, that's some of what I think even just as a sense, like so much of this has to do with just how we perceive things. And you know, coming from the East Bay and looking at the Golden Gate, it's like if you do, like I was, you know, one way to participate in a spiritual ecological way is like noting the little peaks and being able to say, I've been to that little tree on the top of that hill and I can see it from far away, and I give a little prayer. And I think the horizon of the ocean is like that from the East Bay, because there's only this little thin strip of it from that side. You don't get this whole span of ocean. You get just this little, I see you, infinity, I will pray to you. And I think that's a similar thing here, where there's such a difference between the parts of San Francisco that are on hills that have solid ground underneath, or maybe sand dunes, but at least some solid rock. And as we go into the next part, you can feel it's flat. You can feel that once upon a time this was just open bay, and little by little they've just filled it all in.
Oh, we had the Superfund site.
Yeah, and the Superfund site, which I was going to mention next round too. Okay. Let's just look at this spot on the corner, and then we'll get back in the car. We'll go to the last spot. If we had time, there's a building on California Street that has a bunch of walruses up at the top. And we were talking about sea lions. They killed like 20,000 walruses a year before electricity was invented, just to light the lamps here in San Francisco. Do you guys notice something on this crosswalk?
It's a circle.
It's a circle. Have you seen this before?
No.
They're all over the bay. Have you seen them?
I used to live on that corner.
Excuse me, all over San Francisco. That's right. Yeah. So this is one of 170 cisterns. So underneath there's a huge cistern of water, and it's emergency use water. So it would be in the event of an earthquake or a fire.
It's still there?
It's still there. Anytime you see this circle of bricks, underneath there's an emergency big cistern of water. Wow. 170 of them, 11 million gallons. They were put in after San Francisco caught fire those 3 times during the gold rush in 1850, and then they were expanded after the 1907 earthquake. I think this creek that came out of the ground here and flows down this way, there's a little bit of agricultural use because it's not as brackish. But again, that difference between water, you don't want to water your plants with salt water. So it's just a balance of figuring out where to source your water for what needs. But then there's a difference between having 7 million people live here and just a little couple of villages. Okay, I think that might be good for here. Let's go to the final spot. Are you guys ready?
Ready.
All right. They would draw a line. They'd say, that's my property, and let's fill it in. So they have these 100-foot sand dunes on Market Street. Let's flatten out Market Street and bring all that sand over here. There's earthquake debris everywhere. Let's just drag that over here and start filling in the bay. You get, in 1909, there was a captain who said this was an open sewer, a cesspool that emitted offensive odors, that if you, bubbles of gas broke the surface. If you fell overboard, you wouldn't last more than 2 minutes. If you took a gulp of the stuff, it would be the end of you. As bad as the stench was, it was the busiest place on the San Francisco waterfront. It was called Dumpville before it was named China Basin.
Oh yeah, China.
Hey, we didn't get too far. The reason it was called China Basin was there was the Pacific Mail steamship line, which was coming from China. As soon as the Mexicans took over, they opened it up to all these different international ship lanes. So there's this huge amount of trade going back and forth. There was bananas arriving, sugar from Hawaii. These houseboats arrived in the 60s, and they were actually on Islay Creek, but they wanted to get away from the shipping, the huge shipping container boats, so they tucked back over here. Yes, there was a lot of iron and steel industry. As you mentioned, there's the Superfund site not too far south of here. That's when things get really majorly gnarly and polluted for a long time. And then they're still engaged. These houseboats and the people who live here are engaged in a current lawsuit with the city of San Francisco for the same reason, where the sewer pipes and the storm pipes bring all the same water down through here. And all of them, they don't swim here, even though they live right on the water, because it just would knock you out.
Well, the Bayview people are suing the city as well.
Yeah.
It was the U.S. Navy.
Right.
Claimed that they cleaned it up. They had radiation there.
Totally.
They had a whole radiation.
Totally. The only other thing that I'll mention about going in this water is you get balls hit from the park, and they land in the creek too. Okay, so the last thing I'll say in this whole tour, because we keep tuning in with all of our senses to these spots, and there's histories and there's stories, and there's also our own sort of minute by minute perception of what takes place here. And I've talked some about this kind of story of cataclysm and apocalypse, and who gets to choose whose apocalypse is, whose end of the world ends first. And I just want to hold up the bay and the estuary as a counterbalance to that in and of itself, because it's just overwhelmingly entangled. It's an ecotone, it's an edge space. There's all these species that get to be born here, and the strength is in the diversity, the strength is in the collaboration. So in contrast to these ends of the world, there's all these sort of new beginnings emerging all the time because of the estuary in and of itself. And I think it's on us to learn how to be in cahoots.
With the sacred waters.
With the sacred waters of the world, right outside our homes and everywhere. Yeah. Okay.
And under our feet.
And under our feet, hidden, flowing. So if you want to fill up if you feel like sneaking out there in your boots, you can. Otherwise, y'all are off the hook. It's my deep honor, and really all credit to the watersheds. None of us could do any of this without the watersheds, so it's much appreciated.